So a lot of the people listening are like, okay, Bill, what's this have to do with me today? And I'm endlessly fascinated with warrior cultures. I think I mentioned to you, I love reading about the Spartans, the Mongols, the Comanches, the samurai. And in the context of Spartans, what can we learn from them from a leadership perspective that you think stands out from this class, this culture, this political system, that looking back on this, we can see that in the middle of the United States, we're in a 250-year, 300-year run right now. The Spartans went about 400 years?
Yes, something like that. Yes.
So what can we learn from them, from what their mistakes and their strength and their leadership?
Well, one thing you can learn is survival of a political community depends in some measure on the virtues of the members of that political community. And look, we halfway understand this. If you look around the United States, can you think of a sports team called the Athenians?
No, we can't.
There's Spartans everywhere, not least at Michigan State University. When I dream at night, sometimes I dream of giving a lecture at halftime about the ancient Sparta at a Michigan State University of Michigan football game. This will never happen, I assure you, but it would be fun. But there's Spartans everywhere. And why? Because there are coaches and schools that want their sportsmen, especially their football teams, but basketball teams too, to have that kind of endurance and strength and team spirit that was exemplified by the ancient Spartans. Now, look, sports are a preparation for war. They're in some sense an image of war. The kind of language that coaches use on the eve of a game is warlike language. So for a country to be able to defend itself, it has to be able to put forces in the field that are not unlike the Spartans. And for a country to be very effective, they need to build up the kind of prestige that the Spartans build up. You need to have a reputation. You don't want to take those people on.
Right.
They're really trouble. That's one part of it. Another part of it I think is important is political institutions. One of the reasons that we've been tolerably successful in the United States is we have political institutions designed to provide for deliberation and perhaps produce wisdom, but also designed to produce consensus. So we have a separation of powers between a president, judiciary, the legislature, and within the legislative body, it's divided between the Senate that has a certain character and the House that has another character. All of this slows down decision-making, but when decisions get made, they usually stick. And that's a great advantage, resoluteness.
Sure.
Which can arise from domestic harmony, promoting domestic harmony. And we're not always so successful at that, but we've done pretty well over the years. And the consequence is that we have a reputation. You don't really want to mess with the Americans.
Well, I love how you brought this ancient culture to life. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I've also noticed, and you and I talked about this concept between your books, these themes that are building around strategy and grand strategy. And this also has a leadership element to it as well. And a lot of my listeners, we talk about innovation quite a bit, and we talk about the ability to respond and the ability to change one's mind and being mobile, not just with your human body but being agile with your mind. And I'm curious, what did you mean by grand strategy and strategy, and as you roll out these books? And maybe you could talk to us about that.
Okay, strategy is focused on a particular struggle. How are we going to win this struggle in these circumstances? And so it's very much tied up with the passing moment. and would be tied up with the technology of the moment, the circumstances in which we find ourselves in now. Grand strategy is something that political communities develop over time, sometimes because they have brilliant leadership, more often by a process of trial and error, in which they learn what it is they need to protect. They come to be governed by a particular political regime that has particular imperatives and that fosters a way of life that they want to protect. And there are certain things that are permanent in conditions. The geography is more or less permanent. So grand strategy looks at a political community in its situation over time, over long periods of time. And it asks what is necessary for this political community to flourish. And it asks what threatens the flourishing of this political community. And so grand strategy involves looking at not just warfare, but looking at the economy, looking at diplomacy, looking at one's rivals and potential enemies and at their character, what they're likely to do. So, if you were a practitioner of grand strategy today, you would want to know what makes Russia tick. What is it that Vladimir Putin is aiming at? What are their resources like? Are they overreaching? Are they much less powerful than they pretend to be? And you'd ask the very same questions about China. What is it they're aiming at? Is that compatible with our flourishing? What sort of resources do they bring to the table? What can we do to limit their capacity to advance their cause in a way that is damaging to us? So you have to know what your own interests are. You have to know what your own concerns are. And then you have to apply the same kind of analysis to other countries of significance, including your allies or your potential allies. What is it they want? How can we keep them on board? So you think in a much larger way. You're not thinking about winning this battle.
Sure.
Or even necessarily this war. You're thinking about flourishing in the long run.
How strong was Rome at this time during the clearly Sparta declined and it declined at some point. Was there an event that caused it to decline, or is it just gradually just disappeared because it just got diluted? The culture was diluted in its message and just became a greater part of Rome.
What destroyed Sparta's strength and reduced it to a kind of backwater that was a kind of Disneyland in later times was overreaching. The Spartans of the 7th, 6th, and 5th century, most of it anyway, understood that their culture, their way of life, was a hothouse flower. They understood that they did not have the manpower to create and sustain a great empire. So they practiced a kind of Peloponnesian isolationism, and they sallied forth from the Peloponnesus, this peninsula that's sort of at the bottom of the Balkans, only when they had to, when there was a threat from the outside that was apt to overwhelm them, like the Persians or the Athens with her empire. But when they were done with the war, they returned to their homeland. They didn't seek to become a great imperial power. At the end of the Third Attic War, at the end of what readers of Thucydides often call the Peloponnesian War, in 404 BC, the Spartans changed their grand strategy. Instead of following a policy of isolationism in order to preserve their way of life, they chose an imperial venture. The effect of the imperial venture was that it displayed all of the weaknesses that earlier generations of Spartans had warned against. That is to say, when they went abroad, they lost their sense of discipline because there was nobody in their community watching them. In the absence of surveillance, they went wild. They learned that their manpower was insufficient for the task. And they got themselves into a series of struggles with other powers, including the Boeotians, the Thebans in particular, in which they fought repeated wars with these people and taught them how to fight. And the Thebans worked out a technique on the battlefield that could blow a hole in the battle line of the enemy. Instead of lining up 8 deep, they lined up 25 deep in one corner of the battlefield. And the aim was to knock a hole in the enemy phalanx, pour through that hole, and hit them from behind. So the Spartans didn't keep up, in a certain sense, technologically. The technology of war, under pressure from the Spartans, the Thebans experimented, and they tried something new, and it worked. And so in 371, the Thebans defeat the Spartans, and the Spartans can't really sustain themselves thereafter because of the loss of manpower. And so in the aftermath of this Battle of Leuctra in 371, the Thebans and their Boeotian allies liberate the Messenians from the Spartans. So they lose the economic foundations for their maintaining a way of life that makes them strong and dangerous. This, by the way, is at a time when Rome is still a power in Italy and has not expanded beyond Italy.
Okay, that makes sense. No, that's interesting. So that answers one of my questions about innovation, as far as they didn't quite keep up to the battlefield tactics, and then lost a critical part of their empire, the Messia, to that group.